When fighting on the front lines, it's vital that any and all equipment you use is capable of handling the dangerous conditions of battle. In the late 19th century, since railways play a massive part in transporting supplies, France naturally wanted a locomotive that would be dependable in the trenches, and after some research and development, they came up with a design that you could say was fairly reliable. After suffering significant losses during the Franco-Prussian War, it became clear to France that their army needed a better means of transporting supplies and munitions. Railways were of course the go-to answer for moving bulk goods, and in 1882 Colonel Péchot worked with the Decouville Company to produce a system that the army could use. I've done a video going into more detail that you can watch here, but long story short, Decouville and Péchot developed sections of prefabricated 600mm gauge rails that could be moved around and laid easily by troops, allowing supply trains to reach remote or otherwise inaccessible places and keep their troops going. 600mm also became the standard gauge the French army used around army bases, forts, and other significant military locations. Naturally, with the adoption of a new railway network, the army needed engines that could not only run on these narrow gauge rails, but also keep working after sustaining damage on the front lines. Paul Decouville, having visited the Festiniog Railway in Wales in 1879, proposed adopting a double Fairlie design. Fairlie's design worked by having one long boiler heated by two fireboxes, which gave the engines their unique double-ended appearance. The boiler and frames were then mounted on two sets of articulated powered bogies, meaning that not only were all of the engine's wheels powered, but the articulation also meant that it could negotiate tighter curves too. Another benefit to the design was that it was double-ended, meaning it could be driven in both directions without needing to be turned around. It was strong, flexible, and could work just as well going backwards as forwards. It was exactly what the army was looking for. Péchot, along with engineer Charles Bourdon, began drawing up plans for their own version of a Fairlie engine, with a few modifications to make it more reliable on the front lines. It was given a double boiler instead of one big continuous one. This way, should the boiler at one end become damaged, the boiler at the other end could keep working. Similarly, should the cylinders or valve gear at one end become compromised, the engine still had an extra set with which it could finish the journey. Despite having two separate boilers, this design only had one steam dome, which was positioned in the cab on top of both boilers. And compared to its 32.5-foot Welsh counterparts, it was much smaller, measuring in at 18 feet 11 inches. The central dome and shorter boilers meant that it could safely climb the steep grades of many fortifications around France, and its low centre of mass would mean it was less likely to derail on wobbly tracks. The funnels would also be fitted with spark arresters, canvas curtains were fitted over the cab doors, and the locomotive would carry around a hose that could be used to fill up its tanks with water from ponds, ditches, and other sources, since water towers would have been rare on the front lines. By 1888, the design had been finalised, and the first of these 0440 engines, or 0220 as they were classified in France, was built that year by Franco-Belge. Dubbed the Pichot Bourdon Locomotive, it was fitted with 650mm driving wheels, 240mm by 175mm cylinders, Walschaerts valve gear, and was capable of handling the steep grades, tight bends, and pulling the heavy loads around France's fortifications. Satisfied, the army decided to officially adopt the locomotive design, and by 1914, 61 Pichot Bourdon locomotives were working around fortifications all across the country. With the outbreak of the First World War, however, France found it needed more engines to help move artillery pieces and keep supplies moving to the trenches. As most French locomotive manufacturers were busy due to the war, 280 engines were ordered from the Baldwin Locomotive Works in the US, with another 15 being built by the North British Locomotive Company in Scotland, bringing the total to 356 by 1916. Despite the seeming advantages the design had over conventional engines, just like the Fairlies, the Pichot Bourdons had their own shortcomings too. As the boilers and fireboxes ran through the middle of the cab, both driver and fireman had little room on the footplate. And while this was a problem the Fairlies had too, it would have been a greater issue on the Péchot-Bourdon engines due to their much smaller size. Their water tanks were problematic too, as they were too close to the boiler. While this came with the benefit of the boiler preheating the water, the hot water also caused the injectors to not work properly, making it hard to keep the water level in the boiler stable. But the biggest problem with the engines was maintenance. Not only did engine crews have an extra set of cylinders and valve gear to maintain, but the draft in the boilers was very strong, causing soot and ash to quickly build up in the smoke box and clog boiler tubes. Given how similar they are to Fairlies too, it's safe to assume they also suffered similar ailments as their Welsh counterparts, such as lack of fuel storage, poor visibility in the cab, and problems with the flexible pipes required to move steam to and from the cylinders. Since no more were built after 1916, it's fair to assume that these drawbacks were enough to dissuade France from pursuing the design further, especially with how successful the more traditional tank engine designs used by Britain, America, and Germany were. After the war was over, many of these locomotives found a new life working on industrial railways all across Europe, while some returned to bases and fortifications in France. But with the abundance of more traditional, easier to maintain tank engines available, it wasn't long before the engines found themselves either scrapped or put to one side. Out of the 356 Péchot-Bourdon locomotives built, only 2 still remain in preservation. One belonging to the Dresden Transport Museum in Germany, while the other resides at the Požega Railway Museum in Serbia. In the end, these articulated Frontline engines, while sound on paper, proved to be fairly unreliable in practice. Maybe with a bit more refinement the design could have worked, but given the inherent problems with Fairlie's design, it goes to show that sometimes doubling the engine can also double the burden. Subscribe for more.